You may be surprised, I certainly have been, to witness the dramatic change in M&A concerning technology companies. Do you know in 2014, less than 15% of all technology company acquisitions were made by non-tech companies? We're approaching 58% as we round out the fourth quarter of 2017. And this would suggest that there is even more dramatic change ahead of us. I've asked Charles Botchway. It's a great pleasure to have Charles with us. He's been a regular on this stage, and with the support of Madison Street Capital, we've been able to assemble, I think, a very dynamic group of individuals to talk to you about that transformation and the impact of innovation on all industry sectors. So please join me in welcoming this panel, a group of veteran deal makers and technology M&A soothsayers. Charles?
Good morning, everyone. As Dave mentioned, we've put together this panel to discuss the impact of technology in the M&A industry. And we've assembled a group of people with very diverse roles in the M&A industry, but the one thing they do have in common is a deep industry and technology experience, and I think it's going to make for a very fruitful conversation. I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about their backgrounds, and then we'll jump right in where we start with you, Jonathan.
Good morning. I'm Jonathan Rouner. I'm a vice chairman at Nomura and look after the firm's international M&A business. Have been at the firm for a number of years.
I'm Richa Naujoks. I'm a partner at Nixon, Peabody, and I'm Law 100 law firm. I focus on mergers and acquisitions and have a unique addition to my practice in that I also represent startups. So I get to see sort of both sides of the value chain, as it were.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Olivier. I'm a partner with Deloitte. I specialize in M&A and technology intersection. And prior to Deloitte, I was CIO, so I've been around technology and M&A for over 26 years.
Good morning. My name's John Metz. I've been a tech banker for 25 years, and I run our infrastructure and cybersecurity banking practice at Jefferies. Spent most of my career at Credit Suisse, and with the Chinese delegation recently advised on the divestiture of Hewlett-Packard's enterprise business to the Tsinghua Unisplinter Group in China.
Thank you all. Let's jump right in. We chatted a little bit earlier and decided we're going to make this a conversation rather than a question and answer period. And so what I want to talk about right now is, as the demand for a technology company increases as far as M&A is concerned, are you guys noticing a changing in the roles of corporate development officers and their M&A advisors? Jonathan, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'd say a couple of things, Charles. First, I would say that technology has had a huge impact on every sector that we deal with in terms of our clients as well as our own business. Right? Technology has transformed industries like retailing for consumer goods and groceries. It has created new industries. Look at Uber and Airbnb and some of these other challenges to traditional automotive and lodging industries. And it has blurred the lines between industries. You see big retailers in discussions to buy insurance companies as a hedge against Amazon moving into the distribution of pharmaceuticals. So fundamental changes. It's also changed our business as advisors. When I got started, which was a number of years ago, the role of an advisor was to give market information, to give access to potential partners, insights around strategy. All that information is broadly available to our clients today. And so technology has raised the bar as to the role and the value added that an advisor brings and requires a real insight into client strategies and an ability to help them use M&A as a tool to respond to some of these fundamental challenges in their own industries.
What are your thoughts, John?
I would say I've observed over the years offensive and defensive strategies to that question. When I started my career as a technology banker, we were the nerds in the corner doing techie deals that no one has ever heard of. And that's back in the day when technology was a vertical I would characterize technology right now as a horizontal, impacting every single industrial segment. You look at companies like General Electric, are they a locomotive manufacturer or an Internet of Things company? Or Tesla, are they an automotive company or a technology company? And we are being approached by participants from every major industrial segment wanting to learn about technology and how it impacts their businesses. So that's the offensive aspect of it. I would say the defensive aspect of what we're seeing, things like omni-commerce, where you're seeing companies defend themselves against emerging threats in their businesses like Amazon, and look almost in a panicked way towards opportunities to understand what's happening, to enhance their capabilities in non-traditional channels and really defend their core businesses against the incursion of these new threats.
I think from my perspective, the impact as an advisor has been pretty deep because there's not a single M&A transaction, being a large merger, acquisition, or divestiture, that where I'm involved, where technology is the most crucial element to get it done right. We've seen all the articles about the people, the culture, all that stuff. I am telling you, as a technologist that does M&A for a living, I'm typically the first one in and the last one to leave. It's so complex, and the amount of money, when you look at the cost of achieving an integration or divesting, the technology impact and getting it right, to me, has changed that. And what the impact for a person like, working at Deloitte, we're having a short, I guess we don't have enough talent that can understand the intersection of technology and M&A. And it's not just being a technologist that's going to come in and use an M&A playbook, or M&A guy's going to learn, or lady's going to learn technology. It's very important to understand the life cycle, to understand the do's and don'ts so you don't repeat your mistakes, and to understand what lever to utilize to accelerate the transaction and to get it done right.
Richa?
I have to agree with Olivier. I'm seeing that as well in terms of from the perspective of the actual nuts and bolts of the transaction. There seems to be increasingly a little bit of a gap between the buy side knowledge of the target and of the technologies, and it could be, and many companies are working hard to get the advisors, get the knowledge in-house, but currently, especially when you look at a large strategic acquisition of a emerging technology, one of the first things that we grapple with is sort of this cultural discrepancy where the buy side is very used to a way of doing things, and the target is usually coming from a very different place in terms of their life cycle, in terms of their culture, in terms of where they are and their aims from the transaction. And that sometimes requires a little bit of aligning of incentives at the start.
Well, actually, that kind of leads right into the next topic I want to talk about. JVs and alliances are relatively common in technology, in the tech industry, and with other companies getting into JVs and alliances with the acquisition of technology companies, how are legal advisors, really guiding their companies through those processes? Richa, why don't you take that?
Sure, and that's a great question, Charles. 15 years ago, when I started my career, it was unheard of. You had an acquisition, it was 100% acquisition, be it stock or assets, was really the only question. The last couple of transactions I've done have been large public companies buying a minority stake in an early stage company, really in order to have access to the technology. And we're seeing this in the entire ecosystem, Comcast, SAP, there's large companies that are actually setting up venture arms, not for any other purpose, but in order to get the first look at the technology that's coming out of these incubators, accelerators. It's sort of broadened what you would typically expect to see in a transaction.
Olivier, as someone who's focused on the integration post-acquisition, what are your thoughts in terms of the changes in advice when it comes to these kinds of transactions?
So I think, for us, it's always interesting, in a JV environment to understand who's controlling the JV and how much you want to put in. Like I said, from what Rachel mentioned, accessing the IP and early look is critical, but also I like to control the outcome. So understanding, how this technology can scale, how it can apply to other domain. For us, it's important to have a team of advisors that can walk the walk and talk the talk of the technology. So we try to bring much more technologies to the table, whereby in the past we had a lot more strategists involved early in the JV. So we're seeing a shift in the talent that we have to bring to the table early stage of the deal versus later on in the deal. Okay.
Has your approach changed, John, in terms of how you advise your clients with these kinds of transactions?
Yeah, I would say a couple thoughts. When I started advising on these types of transactions, the focus was more on valuation, and companies worried about what is the entry price and is it too much, and am I okay with paying this valuation? Now I would say that's almost an afterthought. The bigger question for mergers of non-traditional and technology companies is, how do I not kill the company I'm buying? And far more prevalent than the valuation discussions. And that goes along the lines of governance and managerial responsibilities, because these are by nature entrepreneurs that don't like to be told what to do. And then secondly, the rank and file employees, the motivations and what will drive them in their daily business. So I've worked on a number of transactions where you are basically, you're as a tech company, you're being acquired, but you are fully autonomous and not part of the decision-making umbrella, if you will, with separate incentive structures, separately priced stock options, separately priced bonus structures, and all in the hopes of not killing the company you buy. Far more prevalent than the valuation.
Yeah. What do you think, John?
Well, it's interesting. We see many more of these kinds of transactions, and I think they have many benefits, but also clear disadvantages. The benefits for an alliance or a joint venture are obviously access to technologies, a way to share the cost of acquiring those technologies or products. And as John and others have mentioned, a way to preserve, to some extent, the independence of the source of that technology, so you don't kill it by integrating it into a larger organization. At the same time, there are clear disadvantages. The complexity of governance, the complexity of operating a joint business, the illiquidity of that investment, and ultimately the challenge of unwinding it at some point in the future. We find where JVs and alliances are most successful is when they're really a first step towards an ultimate integration and a closer collaboration between two enterprises, and viewed in that way can make them most successful.
Olivier, I want to come back to you to piggyback on what John started. What kind of challenges does it create for somebody who's responsible for merging and integrating two companies where there's a potential to to make a decision as to whether to leave the culture that's being acquired alone or whether to try to blend it into the overall culture of the acquiring company? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I try not to kill the golden goose egg, basically, right? After you're spending all that money on them. So I've seen just about every approach, from some that have failed miserably when they try to move the people in your headquarters, sit them in the same environment as your regular or legacy employee, and which totally kills all the innovation spirit, things like that. And also I've seen the scenario where you leave them at arm's length, and then you end up having a diverging outcome from the strategy you're trying to accomplish. So to me, it's probably one of the biggest challenge to getting it done right, because I've seen the entire spectrum, and I can tell you it gets ugly pretty quickly. If you spend all that money and you're sucking basically the life out of it, right? So.
Right. Jonathan, what do you think? Are valuations moving beyond the comfort level for strategic buyers?
Well, I think there's no question that valuations of technology businesses are at record levels, both in the public equity markets and in the private M&A markets. I think valuations for technology-oriented businesses are made even more challenging by a couple of elements. The first is that often there is a defensive element to the value of a technology business. That is, not only in controlling that technology, but in precluding your competitors from having access to that technology. And we see that every day, and what that requires is an understanding not only of the incremental value that a certain technology brings to a buyer, but the value that it creates in protecting the existing core business. And trying to quantify it and understand that is a challenge. I think the second element we see is often technologies have different values in different applications. By way of example, our firm advised Kodak a number of years ago on the sale of its OLED technology. This was publicly disclosed. It was sold to LG of Korea. Kodak basically had the intellectual property, and they had royalty income from its use in other people's businesses. But that was the extent of the value to Kodak, was really the royalty stream. But LG, who acquired the business, or acquired the technology, used it for its next generation of flat screen TVs, which have been enormously successful. So it had a completely different value to LG because it could take that technology and commercialize it in ways that Kodak never could. So I think technology valuations appear to be very expensive, but in some ways that requires some real analysis to figure out if that's actually the case to the buyer.
Can I just add to this really quickly? I've also seen scenarios where companies have basically doubled down on the usage of technology to increase the valuation of their spin-off. And we have seen a case, which I can't share the name, but basically the valuation went from $7.5 billion to $8 billion simply by moving most of the company's platform to the cloud and being able to tout the fact that being able to nimble, and when you acquire the spin-off and be able to grow it faster, that will move the needle by $500 million. To me, that was I thought it was a very interesting move, and it paid off in Throve. So we're seeing a lot of that happening right now too.
Can I chime in here? It's interesting actually because I think to your point, valuation can mean different things from different perspectives. So from the perspective of a tech company that's sort of putting itself out to market, when you're looking at valuation, what the valuation you're going to get in a Series C fundraise versus an acquisition versus a joint venture versus a minority stake acquisition, they may be completely different. And when we're advising the founding team or the entrepreneurs, a little bit of what I get to see is sort of their balancing of valuation versus growth versus keeping employees happy. There's a whole host of factors that go into what they choose in terms of finally the exit strategy.
What are you finding in your practice, John?
I would say back to the cultural issues. When I advise players on the sell side, I'll literally pull the CEO aside and I say, if you can present your team as an enthusiastic participant in the ecosystem that they're trying to establish, that's worth 10 to 20% extra valuation and may be the threshold to get a deal done. So I'm strongly encouraging them to think in that respect. And the other thing, particularly in cross-border transactions, I go back to a Confucius term that I like to quote sometimes. If you want to move a mountain, start by carrying small stones. US technology entrepreneurs typically want things to happen like this and move very fast, and that's not typically the case with some cross-border situations, particularly with cultural implications. So I strongly consult the board and the CEOs to be cognizant of that and to think in the bigger picture and the opportunities for themselves.
Okay. Now coming right back to you, John, how are buyers assessing the value of their businesses before and after technology acquisition?
Well, it's hard because sometimes on the buyers, particularly non-traditional buyers, you're asking companies being valued at sometimes low double-digit earnings multiples to buy companies at low double-digit revenue multiples. And that is an interesting initial conversation. But thinking again from the bigger picture, on the buy side, we ask ultimately, what are they trying to accomplish long term? Because typically, a non-traditional company buying a technology company, if they're just looking on a short-term basis, either strategically or financially, you can't get there. So we ask them to think, what are their long-term objectives and how is this going to fit into where the company wants to be in 10 years? And that's usually the starting point.
Okay. Anybody have anything to add to that?
I would agree with John. in my industry, a lot of my clients who are making these acquisitions are really what we talked about earlier, the offensive and the defensive. A lot of these are frankly defensive, where you've got large companies in sectors like like manufacturing, like publishing, which are sectors that are on the decline traditionally and need to remain relevant to younger consumers, to millennial consumers. And one of the ways of doing this is improving their technology platform and offerings, and that's really what we're seeing. So the value pre and post, of course, does play a role, but more than that, it's sort of staying relevant and staying topical.
So in parting, what would you guys say is going to be the lasting impact of this technological revolution on the M&A industry? If you had to think of one thing that's going to really change the business and continue to change the business, what would you say it is, Jonathan?
Well, I think that technology will continue to serve as an engine for the M&A industry for a long time. Much of what we see is our corporate clients and others using M&A as a tool to respond to these technological changes, whether it's acquiring technologies, whether it's considering this consolidation within industries, whether it's considering these dramatic deals between industries as a vehicle to try to respond to technology. Technology is moving in many of these cases at a pace where organic responses are insufficient, and M&A is a key tool to help clients respond to these changes.
I'd like to add maybe a slightly additional perspective. Three deals have been part of pretty large scale, $30 billion plus divestiture or spin-off recently in order to unleash more of the company that had the technological advantage. For instance, I led the entire separation from eBay and PayPal, right? And you can look at the result of the stock for eBay and PayPal after I did that deal probably 2 years ago, completed that. I then continue on and I went to 2 other Fortune 100 companies, one in CNIP and one in the banking industry. And I can guarantee you the entire reason for the deal was to unleash the potential of the downstream company that was much more technology focused and was hampered by the parent. So the reason why I want to share that perspective is that it's okay to look at the acquisition syndrome and things like that, but there's also huge potential in the market of company that will then spin off technology arm that will be much more powerful as a self-standing entity and maybe later on being acquired. So keep an eye out for that because I've seen that trend a lot. So.
Richa?
Ivan, this was said before, I think over time, I think the distinctions between industries are going to get less and less clear, where a manufacturer of flat screen TVs, is it an Internet of Things company or is it a manufacturing company? And I think that's the kind of distinction where it starts to get blurred. So if you asked me 5 years ago, I would say I practice in healthcare and financial services, and now I say health tech and fintech because it just happens to be more accurate even for the exact same companies that I used to work with.
How about you, John?
And I would just quote a soundbite, ignore technology at your peril. Because technology has become a horizontal, it is impacting every single industry. And you may not be ready to pull the trigger on a deal that's 2x the valuation you think it's worth, but at least be knowledgeable and understanding of how that will impact your business. I'm sure there are a number of automotive executives that would have wished they would have heeded the advice of what they were hearing about Tesla a long time ago. Or in the retail sector, what Amazon was going to do to their business models. So ignore technology at your peril.
Thank you all very much. Much appreciated. All right. Thank you.